Well, thanks everyone for coming. Why don't we get started? It's 10 minutes after 1 o'clock. So we have the room until 4. If we end early, we end early. And my intention is to read the room and tailor this to what you would like to do. So I thought I'd have to say a few things up front, and then we'll introduce ourselves. There is a sign-in sheet going around. I think one of the best things that can come out of this is the group of scholars now assembled who will know about this data and are interested in it and can talk to one another. So maybe we'll set up a Google group that you can opt out of or something like that and take it from there. The slides that I'm going to be using today are here, this link. So my webpage is www.demog.edu. ~Redwards, REDWARDS, and then the data tab there. And so the PDF flyer that went out should have brought you to this page. And here are the slides. If I just click on this link, there I go. While I'm in the web browser, let me also say that hrsonline.isr.umich.edu at the University of Michigan. This is the source for the HRS data, and ICPSR might have a separate place for downloading it, but they might well just direct you to this. And so if you type in that URL, which would probably come up first thing in Google, I think it takes you to where the study data actually are. And it turns out this is a multifunction website. If you're actually in the HRS, you get to click on this link. That would be interesting. I keep pinching myself. Well, I'm almost age eligible. I think you are too. And that's a bit of a shock. So here, the researcher site is where you would want to go, and everything is here. Now, as I think folks have remarked, there is just so darn much here that it's very helpful to have somebody like me walk you through what's here and what you can do with it, or to email me or call me up or visit or something like that. That might be even better. Anyway, so here's the website, and just to sort of have that as a flag. So let me go back to my slides here and kick us off. So I'm Ryan Edwards. I'm now with the Division of Data Sciences here. I was a professor of economics on the East Coast, and I was a member of cohort 21 back here in the demography department, roughly cohort-ish with Gretchen, who's sitting here to my right, and we'll introduce ourselves in a second. The other thing I wanted to say is that 20 years ago, 1998, right? 20 years ago or so, Ronald Lee was in this room explaining about this data set. And at the time, he had been talking, I think, with Richard Sussman, who's now deceased, but he had been the head of the National Institute on Aging. The HRS was a roughly, brand new-ish data set back then. The first wave was conducted in 1992, and I remember sort of a here's the data presentation that happened back then in the late 90s, and I wrote my dissertation with it. It's been a long and wild and fun ride, and I hope this can also be a fun ride for you today. So, and I promise we will get to introductions. I just wanted to say thank you to NIA and thank you to CEDA, the Center on the Economics and Demography of Aging, for this. This is actually the center grant designation, and a pilot grant then was given to Josh and me to do some work again on HRS, and so we wanted to express our thanks. And I also wanted to give a huge shout out to the incredible team at HRS, and these are just the best people you're ever going to meet. They want to help, and they are a fairly lean operation over there. It's not like they have lots of time or money, but they are really, really helpful. Especially the current HRS director, which is David Weir, whom I've had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times. And he is a really smart person who's also really busy, but he finds time to help, which is fantastic. There are 2 background publications that I've drawn a bunch of graphics from, and they are listed here with hyperlinks. And so my hope is that the PDF that you can download should have these hyperlinks working, and if they don't work, please let me know. That would be a rude surprise. So with that, let me now turn over to introductions. And so just for kicks, you might say your name, your field, or your program, why you're here, why HRS is interesting. And you also might just talk about whether you've ever participated in the survey. And so I'll just repeat again. I'm Ryan Edwards, economics, demography. HRS is interesting to me because I've kind of created a bunch of my professional life around it, which has been wild now to look back at the past 20 years. And I think my favorite survey that I participated in was the National Household Transit Survey, which details what you do in a day in terms of traveling around, whether it's to work or something else. And so I happened to be told that, well, here's your diary day. You need to keep a travel diary on that day. It happened to be when our first daughter was still in utero, and we drove out to West Marin, which was a very memorable thing. And then I diaried all of it, and they ask you, well, where did you go? And you have your geocodes of where you were. Did you get out of the car? Did you walk? And all that. And what's fantastic is it emblazoned this memory into my brain of that day, right? Well, now think about people in the HRS doing this every 2 years. Yeah, not the whole day, about 2 hours worth, but it really is remarkable. And many of you may have stories about this or other data sets that you're in. So with that, let me pass along to Gretchen, who's sitting here to my right.
Hi, I'm Gretchen. I'm a researcher in the demography department. I live off-site, which is why so many of you are new faces to me. HRS is interesting to me, so I work on national transfer accounts with Ron Lee, which is about disaggregating economies by age. But we're also trying to add to that a set of accounts that gives the unpaid care work economy by age. So this isn't in your usual surveys, but HRS has good data on sort of how much care elders are receiving, and also I'm hoping how much care they're producing, because that's something that we're trying to bring to light more, that older people are producing care as much as they are receiving care, both for each other and for grandchildren and things like that. So I've never been in a survey other than a push poll before I realized you should never answer your phone if the contact is not already in your phone. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Bobby Chocolo. I'm a graduate student at San Francisco State. I'm studying economics. My research, what brought me here is my research. Right now I'm working on a project that studies the effect of New Deal era programs on the children of those who may have been employed by them, using the Wisconsin longitudinal survey. So this data is not directly related to that, but it's a similar type, so it captured my interest. And I have not been in any surveys that I've participated in. I am sure that due to my social media, I have produced a lot of data for someone. I also do work with social media data, so believe me, you do produce a lot of data. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Elaine Haro. I'm a first year PhD student in the Health Policy program in Population Health Sciences. And I really wanted to come in general to see the demography home. Well, some of my research interests include immigrant health, and most recently I started questioning myself regarding the older immigrant population, specifically the undocumented population. Just wondering, there's not too many studies on this population in particular, so I just wanted to learn more about the HRS. And I actually have participated in a survey for the past 7 years. I have been part of the longitudinal study of American youth through the University of Michigan. So every year, every summer, I get a questionnaire in the mail.
Wow.
Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Garcia Valdivia. I'm a sociology PhD student. I'm working on my dissertation, which focuses on old age immigrants, specifically Mexican origin. I'm interested in HRS again because of the data on old age immigrants. Particularly, I'm interested in the new wave because I want to know if immigrants are captured well enough in that survey, especially because there would probably be some IRCA recipients in the next couple of waves. Not just this one, it might be this wave and a couple of years for the next wave.
Cool.
And I filled out my parents' census.
Yeah, cool.
And that's what I've done.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd be, and besides like psychology surveys that happen on campus and things like that when I was an undergrad.
Cool.
But the census I think is the only one I filled out.
Fantastic. Maybe we'll go into the back there.
Okay. Hi, I'm Citra Golden-Miller. I'm a faculty member in public health at University of California, Merced, our sister campus in Central Valley. I'm a suicide researcher, epidemiologist by training, and I'm interested in HRS potentially for future research, but also because I'm involved in a grant application at Ellen.
I'm Ellen, yeah. And I'm on the faculty here in School of Public Health, and my appointment's in environmental health sciences, but I'm a trained biostatistician epidemiologist. And I'm writing a grant to look at suicide in a couple of existing cohorts, mostly actually occupational cohorts, large longitudinal groups of auto workers and aluminum workers. But I also want to use HRS because I need a general U.S. population sample so that I can see if our results in these cohorts are transportable to this general population. And so I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this data set. Basically, I'm interested in job loss and suicide. That's the main focus of that.
I'm Holly. I'm a doctoral student in epidemiology. I'm also working on said grant with Ellen. But more broadly, my dissertation is on women in the manufacturing workforce in the U.S. and sort of elements of the workplace that may predispose female workers in particular to depression and anxiety. And we have this really, really rich occupational data because it's an occupational data set, but what we're missing, from that data set is anything about family structure, which for women in particular, I would really, really, really like to know about. So it's really exciting for me that HRS has both work and family characteristics in it, and the ability to study both of those simultaneously and how they inform one another is really, really, really exciting to me. I also took economic demography with you, Brian.
Oh, cool. Awesome. That's wonderful.
Yes.
Hey, I'm Victoria. I'm like totally out of place here because I'm kind of starting a career transition, kind of like total career transition. So I'm just kind of here to like see what people do with social data science kind of stuff. And kind of get a feel for just in general, because I was a pastry cook, so it's completely different.
Cool.
And I have not done anything.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a first year PhD student in demography. I'm brand new to HRS, but I'm coming from Minnesota's Pop Center, so I'm always interested in learning new stuff about survey data. And I don't think I've personally ever participated in a survey.
I'm Dennis. I'm a third year PhD student in demography here. I am writing a paper on using the HRS data on stress coping mechanisms among the elderly spousal caregivers. Okay. So I just want to learn more about ways to wrangle the data. And the most remarkable survey, which is I've ever participated, was just the public opinion poll before the last election, presidential election. Yeah.
You were in it?
Yeah.
Really? Who conducted it?
No, sorry, I didn't read it. I just did it. Like, as a participant.
Yeah, you were in the study.
Okay.
Which
It wasn't
polling?
Gallup. It was some other firm. Yeah.
There were many coming
Yes.
out constantly all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to know which one it was and how wrong or right they were. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting post-mortem about all that. Anyway.
I'm
Carl.
Carl Lowe. I'm a staff member in demography and Center on the Economics and Demography of Aging, and sort of help facilitate things from time to time. I work on the human mortality database. Mortality is sort of my thing. I once tried using HRS, once tried helping an undergraduate with her senior thesis using HRS. And we first tried using the RAND data version, which I think is what Ryan will be talking about. But this woman was interested in complex household structure, so the RAND really didn't address our issue, and we contacted the helpful people at Michigan, and the response was, "Oh, that's a really hard question."
Yes, it is.
So always start with something simple first that you can sink your teeth into before going into really hard. I felt really bad. I couldn't help her with HRS.
Yeah.
I participated in, I didn't participate in NSF survey. I think it was follow-up from demography
Yeah,
folks.
just the,
And I tried to take it online, and we did this back and forth, and I finally filled out, I got a hold of the physical survey, and I filled it out, and then I could never turn it in. So it was a failed response, not my fault.
Yeah.
I
So,
had forgotten about this.
Yeah.
Like people who finished
The
PhD.
doctoral studies,
Yeah,
survey
yeah.
of doctoral recipients or something
Yes.
like that, the SDR, yeah. No, that's
I
interesting.
feel I'm irritated because I'm sure I'm flagged as a non-respondent
Yeah.
in the database.
You would like a different flag.
I would like a different flag.
Well, this is fantastic. There are some common threads we probably all had noticed. Well, one of them is family structure. Another one is immigration status, and those are both measured in HRS. The family status or family structure one is indeed rather challenging. I think there have been some inroads made over the last decade to try to improve that. Immigration status is measured. We don't have second generation status, which is a big problem. The unauthorized, it's sort of been the hot thing over the last decade to actually impute that, and so I don't know whether folks have ever tried to do that in HRS. What I can say is that there are a lot of Mexican American first generation immigrants in the sample, as you might imagine. It's the biggest group within the Hispanic subsample. That group you definitely could look at for sure. The other common threads here: the family structure, so occupation and employment. Yeah.
Employment history and reason for leaving work.
Yeah. Reason for leaving. It's not something I ever have personally looked at. It's certainly part of it all because of retirement as being kind of this big part of it. Yeah.
Right.
I think one of my pitches was, well, it's not just about health and retirement. Now, it sounds like most folks are here because of health and retirement, and that's fine, and you're in the right place for that. Other things are there as well, and my silly joke is if you've had a kid recently like I have, you might know about Finding Momo, which is sort of the Where's Waldo of the 21st century, and it's because this reminds me of where's Waldo in the midst of all this chaos, because there are just so many different things that are covered here. Friends and social networks is one thing that I've thought about that's right there, and I just kind of tossed stuff up here as I thought about it, really. Work history certainly is in there in some way. Reason for leaving, that's a good question. You would think that with a lot of the psychosocial stuff that's in here, so there's a leave behind questionnaire that gets really into the weeds about all sorts of things. Yeah. Probably it's going to have stuff that would tell you a little bit about kind of the, how satisfied or unsatisfied were you with the job. But it's not something that I have looked at directly. The biomarkers, that could be, if you like, a direct look at stress. That's another thing now that the dataset has ever since 2006. Consumption and spending, so I didn't hear specific interest about that, but I know Gretchen also said time use, and it turns out these two things are in the same mail-out survey that's a part of HRS. There also are questions about time use and caregiving in the core questionnaire too. So there's just so much that you can do here. You can look at Social Security earnings histories and the restricted data, and you can find Momo. There's just every old thing you possibly could do. So, is there anybody who could sit down and tell you every possible thing? Yeah, it's David Weir, I think, the director. He's so smart. I'm not that smart. These are the things that I have done. So I've done, stretching back into the 90s, something about what we call a portfolio choice, holding stocks versus bonds. You have that kind of information, not individual company stocks, but you have some sense of how much liquid wealth is in either stocks or bonds, and that's a measure of kind of how risky or safe you are. You have health status and also some expectational variables. What do you think about is going to happen down the road? Military service, I had several papers that looked at that sort of thing, and what's interesting about that is that you can kind of get a life cycle view, and there are other ways in the data set to get life cycle views of things. Biomarker collection started in 2006, and so one thing I did was to look at the advent of this and think about whether it contributed new information. And it did for some people. It's not a huge issue. probably the bigger issue there, just to be aware of, is in order to collect biomarkers, so it's blood composition and blood pressure, the physical measures also, you have to be visited in person. And so that's probably the most sort of first order effect right there, is that, you know, mode of entry matters. If you're on the telephone, that's different from being in person. And that was kind of one of the big punchlines there. Most recently, so Josh Goldstein and I looked at the Hispanic first name, and the how Hispanic your name is, you can measure relative to the rest of the data set, and that's what we did. The first name is not in the data set, of course. We had to get special access for that, but they did it. I mean, HRS is amazing. They let us do this. And it turns out that how Hispanic your first name is seems to matter differently for foreign-born versus native-born Hispanics. As soon as I say that, you're like, oh, of course it does. But you know, it's the same measure, and it turns out that it seems to pick up different things depending on whether you're a foreign or a native-born Hispanic. Socioeconomic gradients in health among Hispanics. The story there is that if you look at the sending countries where U.S. Hispanics and their descendants may have come from, you often see a very different socioeconomic gradient. It's usually flatter. Luis Rosero Bixby and Will Dow, I think, have research that suggests it's that the least well off are not as least well off in those countries, that it's kind of a raising the lowest of the low up, and that seems also to be the case in this country as well. So I'm talking a lot here, and let me just say that one of the other things to think about is, well, why use the HRS? Part of it is the question and the coverage. Part of it is this panel nature of the data set, that you get a view of people over time, which isn't impossible to find, especially in social media data like we were looking at the brown bag on Wednesday. A lot of times there, that stuff is repeated observations of individuals. It's rare to have something that is this rich. HRS is a very, very rich data set where people contribute 2 hours of survey time, and you get these repeated observations of individuals who probably are paid money to do this. So that would be my guess. That would be the question I'd have, is why do these people keep doing this? And it's somewhat, I think, to some extent, it could be a generational thing. That it's kind of like, why do people vote, right? And you see this in the yeah.
I was just actually looking at one thing about response rates recently online, and it looked like the response rates were lower in the more recent cohorts. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, I've got a slide that I borrowed from their work here. So, sorry to jump the gun. These are different birth cohorts. The original HRS cohort is actually younger than the AHEAD cohort. The children of the Depression age, or CODA, the war babies, WB, then were younger than these children of the Depression era who were born before the World War II, and early baby boomers, EBB. And so how to look at this, I think it would be the wave one is kind of the response rate out of the drawn sample, and apparently, I mean, this is kind of interesting to me. My parents were war babies, so I think it was Ron Lee, right? Born in 41, I believe.
41.
Yeah, and so that would be him. And it looks to me like this is a little bit lower than here. I believe what happens here is the story, once you're in the survey, but only 70% of them were, what's then your response rate in each of the following waves, having actually conditional on being there. So I'm not sure it's monotonic.
Yeah.
I think the punchline they emphasized here was that it was fairly high, actually.
Yeah, compared
Isn't there
to.
another row? Isn't there a...
I wish there were, not in this graphic. Let me show you. Yeah, and it's cool because I like this, that we should be jumping around and answering the questions that you have. So what does this show us? This shows us the different colors are these different cohorts. The HRS cohort, born 1931 and 1941. Again, sorry for the size of the text here, but it's in the slides if you want to look at them in the PDF. So they were first looked at in 1992, and this is their age range, and they sort of marched this way. So it's kind of like a Lexis diagram a little bit for folks who know the demography stuff. But of course, the funny thing here is that not everybody dies at age 92. I don't know why this is up there. And I don't believe they top code the age either. I don't think they top code age at death or current age. So, it should be showing some gradual upward progression. It actually doesn't. What this is saying, though, is that, so here are the new cohorts that have been introduced. So the war babies, and it looks like, unfortunately, this is very hard to see the distinction. Here are the early baby boomers. And let me think. So Josh is what, I think he's maybe a late baby boomer. So I was born in the 70s, so I'm not in here yet. But so here's the late baby boomer cohort, first interviewed here in 2016. So there are all these different birth cohorts that keep getting asked to participate, and I think that's probably true that you might see some difference in the participation rates. But and getting back to the polling stuff, right? One thing we really do know is that civic engagement is strongly related to age. I mean, sure, the birth cohort is, of course, it's important. Then there's this age-old thing. Well, what's most important is the time or the age or the cohort effect, and I guess I'm inclined to believe that age is a big deal because you're older, you are wiser, you have a little bit more time, and you believe in things like this. And also HRS, I think, probably tries to explain exactly why it's good to participate in HRS. I mean, they certainly do a very good job, I would say, to us, to researchers. So the other punchline here is that HRS is rather unique. Unlike WLS, which is a great survey, it was just more or less one birth cohort. I mean, depending on how you define it, say 5 years or so of birth cohorts, people who graduated high school, I think, in Wisconsin in a particular sort of 2 or 3 year period or something. Most of the longitudinal surveys you'll see look like that. So like the Ad Health study is similar. It's probably about 10 years of birth years. The NLSY is also, there are different sort of iterations of it, but they always take sort of a clump and then follow that clump forward. HRS is really rather unique that it keeps grabbing new clumps and somehow incentivizing the clumps to go along with it. So at each point in time, you also can use the HRS to tell you something about the population age 50 and over. And that's very helpful. The other thing, remember, we looked at this. So suppose you were interested, as we were at the time, in say, Hispanics and health. So there are important dynamics before age 50, and yes, you do lose those if you look at HRS. To be honest, most of the health dynamics don't really show up until you're older. So it certainly isn't telling you a lot of the reasons why you might be healthy or sick in old age, unless you have retrospectives, which HRS does. But the point would be, well, we'd like to know what happens in high school. Of course we would. The other big data sets might be something like the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And it turns out that when we looked at that, the Hispanic subsample of HRS was actually bigger. And it's because they've oversampled African Americans and Hispanics. So it's kind of mind-boggling just how much stuff it does. Let me see if I can get a little bit back on track here. So what I wanted to talk about today was a whole bunch of things. Overview of HRS and how variables are named, because you will need to dive into this. And it's for the big kids. It's tough. I think Dennis had mentioned this. It was very hard getting started in this stuff. I remember it, and Dennis said it's hard doing this. It is. So I thought I would spend some time there. That said, I think if you got to get out of here soon, and there's a question you want to know, I think all of us would agree, well, we'll get to that. So you could just ask your question if you need to leave and don't want to see the whole shebang about the variable naming conventions and how you kind of work with the actual data. I have some of that, but I also have other stuff to talk about here. So how would you find stuff on topic X in the HRS? That's a pretty important question to ask and a pretty important answer to supply. I'll talk about the contents and the scope, some practical tips working with the variables. I have a little bit to say about statistical languages. I think we'll cut that if need be, because it's a little bit out there really. And I work in Stata. I think SAS is the other weapon of choice for many people who use HRS. And I think our users probably are gradually using the data more, but it's not easily set up to be used by R, I wouldn't say. So I'm going to use Stata. I hope it'll be It's nothing super fancy, so clear enough to kind of be broadly useful. And if we have time, I can talk about a little bit more about the biomarkers and Hispanic names stuff. So, but again, let me emphasize, this is all for you guys. And if you'd like to talk about something you're not seeing discussed, please do just ask for it. So this was fun. I stole this image, this is great, this is academic view, so, I took these little images off the internet, of course, as we always do when we're putting slides together. HRS looks at the ages in the blue boxes here. I had to wonder, well, why is it that the male, I guess blatantly sexist, which I'm very sort of leery of now more than ever, but as I should have been all the whole time, I don't know what's going on here, but it's
I have to start wearing ball gowns?
Right, and you have to start spinning around, but there is so if you're a little boy, you have to play like this. If you're a girl, you have to play like this, and you have to wear, that's the cocktail dress, that's the ball gown, so. And the other thing is, why are there only 7, I think, for the woman and only 8 for the man, and they both have canes, so they're both crawling. So there's equality at both ends of the age distribution. Okay. The other thing to say here is that there are same-sex couples in HRS. It's not as though everybody's heterosexual, and they're measured. It's 2 or 3% of the sample, like it is nationally, or ish. It's something that can kind of fluctuate depending on how you measure it. I don't believe there's not a specific question that asks about that, and that's so you will find that in some other surveys, but so stepping back, it's one of these things you kind of have to impute from the data rather than have an actual question about it, but there are same-sex pairings there. The other thing I wanted to say is that the blue boxes are where the data gets measured. If you're in the survey, you get measured at those ages. But the other 2 big stories are retrospective questions about your childhood and what it was like growing up, and also about what your parents were like to some extent. Not a ton, because again, the core survey is supposed to be about 2 hours, but there are these things in the data set that you can use. And when I started to use the data back in the late 90s, a lot of times what we did was use these past measures of your life as instrumental variables, something that would tell you about the current developments that was sort of previously set and should be uncorrelated with any other disturbance currently. As I've said that, you probably are all rolling your eyes. We thought that was useful to do in the 90s. There are, I think, more sort of complex and good scientifically sound ways of kind of looking at this stuff today. Just to put a period at the end of the sentence there, those variables are there, and they will help, in some way, regardless of sort of what your belief is about a good study design. Administrative data are also available, and in particular, Social Security earnings can stretch back into this period. It's capped, or let's see, at the earnings cap, right? So it's earnings that are covered in Social Security, which is not everything. So there's this truncation problem. But when you look at the data, it's pretty cool that you can actually measure that stuff. I think one won't see industry back that far. You're going to have that kind of history within the data set itself. And I shouldn't say any more because I don't know any more about it. So here's sort of a family tree-ish look of how other people across the generations do show up in the data set as well. To what extent are they there? It's mostly data like age at death, if that happened, and education. So there are, in fact, some data on kids so full-blood kids of the current couple. There might be siblings involved, and they're there. One of the studies that we were looking at was, does the information about a sibling's death tell you anything about your own health risks? And as you might imagine, it should. And so you can measure that to some extent, but traditionally that hasn't been quite as good as this level of stuff, which I think has been plumbed a fair amount for that. So if you're interested in mortality and perceptions, that's one thing that you can do, is look at the parental history and levels of education and ages at death. Here was one thing that really stood out to us. Yes?
Do you have cause of death? Do you have
Yeah, that record.
We have that for the respondents.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
not for the spouses.
And also for the spouses, if they were ever, so they have to have been captured in the survey. So
Yeah.
if you were married at age 18 and then got divorced from that person would not be in the sample. The other thing to say is that respondents can be male or female, so there's no particular bias about, sort of who that leaves out. So, I wouldn't, if you were looking explicitly at this, well, do you get married young and then what happens? That might be a problem because we don't always measure the spouse. But provided that spouse is married to you age 50 or over, or in this data set because you're common law or whatever it is, then that person gets married. Gets measured, excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, is, how exactly? Well, you can measure the binary of having died or not, and then the link to the National Death Index will tell you the cause of death. That's also restricted data, the precise cause of death, but it can be had. Yeah. Okay. So the family file, which is put together by RAND, the RAND folks really have done a huge amount of heavy lifting here with trying to make the data set usable. And I think I've got a slide about the family file a bit later. It was, it's a challenge, and this is what Carl was talking about, that many different ways of asking the question, many different waves, and when does it get asked and how, and because there can be developments, obviously, especially if you're thinking about following the, whether they're alive or not. You have to kind of check up on that. And it was not in real good shape the last time I gave this seminar, which is 5 years ago. And I think it's better. It has to be, right? Because RAND put out a new version of the family file, which measures things like the kids and also the siblings. This is pretty good. It's just that you don't get a lot other than age and education. And of course, often you're going to miss father's education because the father is not known a lot about in some cases, and that can be a problem. I just do want to put a plug in. So one thing that is pretty cool, though, is so you can measure the mother's and father's level of education and look at the correlation between that and how Hispanic the first name is. And that relationship, as you might imagine, is different for foreign-born and versus native-born Hispanics. And it tells you something, that if you're a native-born Hispanic and your mother's education is higher, you are less likely to have an Hispanic first name. It will be more like the other people in the survey. So parents matter, right? I mean, duh, right? That's a big part of the story of demography, that parents do things that really matter, and we do have some measures of those critical things there. Okay, so we looked at this before. Okay, so here, the punchline again, nationally representative of age 50 and over, and the other fine print is that in the data set, Hispanics and African Americans are oversampled about twice the rate of whites, meaning that they'll show up twice as often, and if you use the sampling weights, they'll be down-weighted appropriately to kind of get a representative story then about the average person over age 50. We do have nursing home residents far enough after age 50. So the survey starts, you're age 50-ish, and then you might end up in a nursing home. If that happens, you're still in the survey. You might have to have what's called a proxy interview because maybe you can't answer a survey question. Especially in regards to the biomarkers and physical measures, HRS is very careful not to to place this undue burden on people who are in nursing homes. But they're in the survey. The thing to be aware of is that the survey weights are designed to give you a story about the civilian non-institutionalized population. So if you use the survey weights that are provided to you, you're going to zero out all of the nursing home residents, which may or may not be what you want to do. And I know this has come back in your research again and again and again, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so you could make your own weights to include those people.
Yeah, that's right. The bottom bullet here, we'll talk a little bit more about mortality with time permitting. They're very serious about good mortality follow-up. And so can you show me a study that says that? And my response is there's a working paper at PAA written by David Weir. And for me, that's pretty good about how it's high-quality mortality follow-up. I wish it were something in, American Journal of Public Health or something like that, but it's not. He's the guy who knows the most about this, and they spend a lot of time tracking people down. That said, there also is non-response in the survey, meaning that people are not able to complete the wave of the survey. So that happens. They've figured out a way to ascertain that, okay, that person isn't dead, they're just not responding. And that's, of course, pretty important for measuring mortality. It would be good to actually measure everybody in the survey. That doesn't always happen. They do get a pretty high response rate, but it's not universally high, and so that's that slide we saw earlier. So here's a story about mortality then. There are links to the National Death Index which give you all of those underlying stories. There also are exit interview details, and I think the exit interviews might also tell you something about the sort of nature of everything, but I haven't looked at those data. What I can say is that compared to the other longitudinal surveys, especially in other countries, the HRS is known to be a lot better quality. And so this is something here in the third bullet that has been remarked, that David Weir and his crew have really spent a lot of time. This is Jim Smith, I think, who has his hand in a lot of the longitudinal stuff. It's probably a funding thing, that HRS seems to have gotten a lot of good funding from the National Institute on Aging. Yeah.
But even if somebody drops out of the study, you could find their mortality information now, right? Like,
that's right, and they do that. So the official way of doing it would be the NDI, so with Social Security number match or something like that, and they do that, and they also do, let's follow up, let's try to find the family and call them, and if they've moved, try to locate them. And so I have no idea what their budget looks like, but it seems to me like this is a pretty big part of it, really.
Well, the mortality part probably the least expensive part, right?
Yeah, it might be, yeah. Because probably you would have to, if there's non-response, I don't know when they give up, but there are face-to-face interviews, and of course to get that person to go out there and actually capture the respondent. It's a horrible way of putting it. Yeah.
The 8,000 deaths you have in the last bullet, is that for all cohorts? Is that current?
I wrote the slide 5 years ago. I guess looking back at this, it does, I guess, seem a little small, but what's happening is the survey keeps getting younger people added to it.
Do you know David Rakoff?
Yeah, David Rakoff, yeah.
David just estimated for me, because I needed to know this information about mortality, that there were 14,000 deaths.
Okay.
In the cohort, and he actually also estimated how many were due to suicide and the causes that we're interested in.
Great.
And I don't quite know how he.
I would take David's work over this. I think this is David Weir. I probably had quoted this. I apologize for not being clear about this. So he wrote this paper for PA in 2010, and so this is through 2006. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, David's fantastic. David Rakoff is down at the School of Medicine at Stanford and has done a lot of work with HRS. And he's also a wonderful person who will answer emails and be very helpful as well. And so I'll just surreptitiously add him to that list that we're having go around. Amel, I'm trying to remember what's Amel's last name again. Amel Harati is another great source for knowledge on HRS data as well. And so I'll just add them both, and we'll just add them to the conversation. Let me just say a few things about the mode of interview. So it used to be telephone after you got into the survey, and I'm not a huge guru on mode of interview. I just found that doing this work on the biomarkers that it matters actually. Starting in 2006, what would roughly happen is that a randomly selected half of the sample would be interviewed face-to-face, and the other half would be on telephone, and then it would switch the next 2 years. If it's randomly selected, then on average you're not going to see any effect in the statistics that you draw out of it. But if you should think a little bit about this if what you're doing is looking at the physical measures, the biomarkers, and looking also at the self-reports in that wave on that individual. And the reason is it matters whether you're in person or on the telephone, how you might reply to things like, do you smoke? What's your weight? Pretty obvious things that might have some bias associated with mode of interview. So useful to keep in mind. And this kind of just makes this point also that the whole panel used to be kind of up here, 80% on telephone. In 2004, Social Security paid a bunch of money to go and interview people in their homes to try to get a higher response rate, yes, for Social Security earnings linkages. And then starting in 2006 was this sort of jagged seesaw thing here where this group is all on telephone. It's because this group is submitting biomarkers and has enhanced face-to-face interviews, and then they switch, and then this group is almost always on telephone the next round. Okay, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about actually using the data in variable names, and we can return to these topical things too. If you know, with specific questions, I thought I would just spend a little bit of time talking about this. So the RAND version of the data set tries to get this more or less right. And why am I sort of putting an asterisk on it? They certainly try. Why is it maybe not perfect? Well, they started this back in the day when having 8 characters in a variable name was very important. And now no longer is that the case. We'll see this here in a second. So, okay, you might like to have a variable that measures weight, just be weight, right? And so here's my fun example of Homer and Marge Simpson and Kirk and Luann Van Houten, who are Milhouse's parents. And I want you to pretend, so I've stopped watching the show, and it turns out they're actually back together. They're remarried, I guess, Kirk and Luann. But I remember watching the show, and they had divorced, and so I just wanted to show you how this is going to play out in the data here as we measure this over time. And you might see something like this maybe if you had these sort of people in HRS. So here's Homer who gains 5 pounds, maybe Marge goes up by 2, and here's 2 for Kirk and maybe another 2 for Luann or something. We're all getting older and a little bit heavier. And if you eyeball it, this is a 2%, right? So 10% of this is 25, and 1% is 2.5, and so double that is 5 pounds, and so that's a 2% gain. This is about a 1% gain, also a 1%, and also roughly a 1% kind of thing. So you might like to see the name weight be in the variable. If you look in the underlying HRS data, before Rand has gotten to it, this is the problem, and Dennis is nodding his head, right? And so there is some information here. It's not even what it is. Why is it GC 1339? Well, especially the 139 means like who knows. The G and the C. Well, the C is probably the most useful part to know. C means that it comes from section C, which is physical health. Knowing the broad structure of HRS is sometimes helpful for digging something out of it like this. I think the most unfortunate part is that G and H turned out they don't really mean much of anything other than H comes after G. That's true, but it is not the case that O being the 15th letter that somehow this was the 2016. You would think that might be O, but it's not. So the H, unfortunately, wait, did I change these? I think I've confused myself completely. The letter doesn't tell you which wave it is. It only tells you that H is after G, unfortunately. And I remember looking back and trying to fix these or something. And I wish that were the case. It's not the case. So the 12th biennial wave was 2014. And so the example I've got, and I'm wondering whether I changed this and forgot to change it back. It might not be GC, it might be OC and PC. I think that was the way I wrote it, and so I'm sorry for that. It confuses me as well. The point is that when RAND gets their mitts on this is what they do. They change it to R12 weight, which means it's the 12th wave of weight measured for the respondent. So the RAND data is a really good way of going because the variable names actually make sense. The pieces of it actually tell you something. The R means that we're talking about the respondent. So this is Homer's weight in the 12th wave, which is 2014. It's the same data as what we're seeing right here. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I think I mucked that up and forgot to change it back. I think it's actually O and P for 2014 and 2016. Okay. The magic then also is that because this is household data and the spouse if present, gets included in the data set. The RAND version of the data set also tells you that right up front. It has already done the merging that you might have to do. When you look at the row belonging to the spouse, it already has gotten moved to another set of columns on this same row for this individual. So here now, for Homer, in wave 12, his weight was 250, and in wave 13, 2 years later, his weight was 255. His spouse's weight in wave 12 was 180. That's because Marge is down here, and her weight in wave 12 was 180. So it gets put over here on this row of the data set already. Yeah.
But, okay, so this is just to make sure I understand, but at least from the point of view of the survey, the respondent and the respondent's spouse are part of the survey, but the respondent and the spouse are filling out all the same stuff, yeah? Or the spouse is only asked
basically, yes. So what you're asking is, does the study interview the spouse and the respondent
in the same way?
In the same way.
They're sort of, I only ask you things that are spousey things in reference to the respondent.
And so the alternative would be that the study doesn't actually ask them everything. They only ask spousey things.
Right.
It's more the former,
Okay.
but there are ways in which it can be the latter. And the reason is there are some things you want to measure that are, in fact, household level things, like assets. That's kind of the household wealth is kind of the most obvious. Income usually is something that gets asked of both people. So there are exceptions, but most of the time, basically, the way to think about this is both spouses are asked to do everything in the survey.
And not to confuse like weights and weights, but
Yeah.
so like, and survey weights are, you're gonna get a survey weight for the spouse, just like you get a
Yes.
survey weight for the respondent. It's not gonna be like 0 like the nursing home people.
Yes. Yes. That's right. It won't be 0.
Okay.
That the spouses are formally part of the survey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One can, my head's spinning because one can quickly get into the weeds, and when you're thinking about how this all works.
Respondent and spouse.
Well, it's challenging because the thing. So here are just 4 rows of the data set, and I think what does happen. Well, we're seeing it right here. I'm sorry, I don't need to make it that complicated. The data set includes Marge here. Here's her data, and it also includes it over here.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you might want to think about it is, well, what is the nationally representative weight in wave 12? And the answer would come out of using this entire column where she exists. So just be careful you don't want to then also use this one, which basically duplicates all that except where it doesn't. But right. So some people aren't spoused up, you could say. So if you use the respondent variable and then the weight, you're going to find that Marge has a non-zero weight, survey weight, and her data shows up as it should and affects all this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you covered this, maybe I missed it, but let's say in a case where one of the spouses is much younger than the other, does it still include their data in there? If they're not
Yes, that's a really good question. So suppose you got a really young spouse. Does he or she show up in there also? And the answer is yes. And so, in fact, it isn't just age 50 and over. It can be, there are people in there as young as 20s, and it's probably, although not guaranteed to be second marriages or whatever it is or something like that. But there are young men and young women in this survey as respondents. I think, then when you pull the tab on, well, suppose you want to know the average weight of people over age 50, those people get a 0 survey weight then, right? So they'll be zeroed out, yeah. Let me just hit the pause button and welcome our new participant. Would you like to just introduce yourself and say a few things?
Hi everybody, my name is Pierre Chitkin. I am a PhD candidate in the graduate school of education and a graduate of the School of Information. I got my master's in 2009, and my advisor is Professor Mahir. So I'm just coming back from a pre-doctoral fellowship year at MIT last year, working on planning my study, which is still under IRB review. And I just got cycle 4 comments, which are very heavy on the statistical model of my study. So I realized I need to get beyond the qualitative methods and get more on the side of it.
Great, welcome. And I'm sorry, I missed your name?
Pierre.
Pierre. Wonderful. Well, thanks. So we do have a good variety of interests here. There was sort of a modal interests around family structure and immigration status, which I've spoken a little bit about, I guess, but at this point we were just kind of talking about the structure of the data set, because it can be a bit on the intimidating side just to start with it, and so that's where we left off here. But the rules are, if you've got a question about the content of the data set, please just ask it. That's, the motivation here was to set us up. Oh, and also there is a sign-in sheet, if you wouldn't mind. I think it's in the middle of the table. If you'd like to add your name to it, the intention was to just kind of try to create this group, and as maybe as a Google group, we can continue the conversation, online afterward, just sharing thoughts on how to do various things and interests in this and other data sets. Okay, so I just wanted to say a few more things about this deal here. So the RAND data set is great because of the naming conventions. A variable like weight actually looks like weight. It's not recorded as something crazy. And then the other thing is that you might also then want to use the spouse information that's on the same row of the data set in a very convenient way. Okay, I guess I should have just pointed out. So here's the thing, right? So they're divorced. In the show, they actually got back together, but let's suppose they're still divorced. And so back to the previous slide, the point is that this would actually be a missing value. Stata codes it as .u, which must mean unappropriate, I don't know, unavailable. I guess that must be what it is. So Stata and SAS do special things sometimes for these missing data codes. They will operate as you might expect, and one of the big questions that if you use R or Python or something other than that is to be careful about what it does to missing values. But my guess would be that if you, and we're getting to this, if you input these data, which are distributed in either Stata or SAS or SPSS format, into something like R probably will figure it out correctly. But so Carl's not sure, and I'm not sure either. That's kind of the thing. It's one of those dicey things that is good to kind of keep a tab on. Are these missing values actually showing up as missing or not? As a side note there, so if you use the underlying HRS data, you will find that for some of the variables missing or refused, suppose you ask somebody their income and they say I refuse it, it might be coded as like a 998 or something. A number that is meant to say to the user of the data set, well, this is not known, but the problem is if it's a numeric variable like income, you might accidentally think they make $998 or whatever it is. The RAND version of the data set won't do that to you, and so that's a really good reason why you can start with that. Okay, so marriage, so why would you care about this? Well, suppose you thought about a model in which the spousal variable mattered. It can just quickly show up for you then as another X variable, because going back to the previous slide, if it's just another column in the data set, you have it ready to go. You don't have to do all the gymnastics of rearranging everything. It's just ready, it's another X variable listed on the same row, which is really, really nice. So obvious ways, household income is just a linear sum, obviously, so beta is equal to 1. If you wanted to run that regression, it's a pretty uninformative one to run. But the other things that you might want to be looking at are things like, well, suppose you think about exercise behavior here on the left-hand side, and you might believe that it's a function of right-hand side variables that are your own, but also things that pick up your spouse's influence on you in some way. And so that's, I think, one of the very strong suits of the data set, that it can inform these issues. Does household structure matter? Well, of course it does. Well, how? And does it matter differently for, say, highly educated households versus less educated households? And you can test that in HRS. Okay, a few more things to kind of set the table up for success with working with the microdata are these. How do you identify people? They don't have names, right? They're not Homer Simpson and Marge Simpson in the data set. They never will be when you look at these de-identified data. And so how does one proceed? They're given these household and person number codes, which then get concatenated into a unique HHIDPN, or household person number concatenation ID, which is the same throughout all history in the survey. You might say, well, what happens if within a household ID you have a split, a divorce, and a new spouse comes in, and the answer is this has 3 digits, so as long as you don't marry more than 999 people, you should be okay. So that was giving me some brain teasing too, though, right? Like, how many different ways are there in which you could have a dissolution of a household and a household coming together, and does this get measured? And I think they have thought about this, and I think they get it right. And I was looking at the microdata and actually trying to track this. That, you know, there is a fair amount of divorce in here, as you might imagine, and it's not everybody, but this appears to track it well. So if you're looking at a particular household, you know, HHIDPN, it's a person, and the fact is that, you know, Kirk Van Houten wasn't married to Luann for a while because they got divorced, and we're pretending they still weren't. And so you just need to kind of think about, are the variables I'm interested in, are they going to be changing in some destructive way for my research because of the household structure? If you're looking at things like wealth or home ownership, that would be a pretty obvious red flag that you need to think a little bit about it. Okay, so the coding thing, you can kind of do either one of these two. You can actually concatenate the strings with the plus sign. If they're stored as strings, if they're stored as numbers, this is what you might want to do. Multiply this by 1,000, which I'm sorry, this gets multiplied by 1,000. I'm sorry, let me just fix that. I'm sorry. It's HHID that gets multiplied by 1,000 and added to PN, and that's how this shows up there. This is what happens when you just got your daughter bathed and into bed, and you're trying to finish your slides late at night. So that's how that works. Another tip too, if you're programming on this, because these tend to get pretty long and squirrely, be advised that the precision of this data structure that's storing this identifier is important. And that's happened to me before, and it's been bad. So how do you check that? What I would do is try to use stuff the way you think you're doing it, and, you know, because why would you need to do this? Well, you might need to link in other information, other variables to an individual using a different data set. And so how would you check to see that you did it right? What I would do is run, you know, counts and means and try to make sure that stuff didn't get lost. Because if you run into a precision problem, it'll decide that this number and this number are the same, for example, even though they're different by 10 units, and it will drop one of them or something like that, and so you'll lose observations. It doesn't happen that common, but that's an often sort of a programming bugaboo that I've run into. Okay, so the way the data are set up here, and now let me introduce a couple of other variables, is like it's like a data frame, you might call it. It's a matrix. Here's our ID along maybe the left-hand side might be nice. Here's 2 measures of weight, 2 columns there. And here are 2 other variables you might be interested in. And these are real variables, R12, VGA, CTX. So remember what I said, Rand tries to make the variable name make sense. Well, here's a way in which maybe it didn't totally succeed there. This is coming out of vigorous physical activity. I don't know what the X is from, maybe index, I have no idea. But so that's what this variable means. It's an index of vigorous physical activity over some period. And so the way this gets coded in the data set, this is a very good variable to use because we're often interested in exercise if you care about health. And it indexes it where 1, it turns out, is the most active, and 5 is the least. 4 is not great, and 3 is sort of in the middle. This, if you recall, was overweight Homer. This is Marge, and so Marge is running around doing all kinds of stuff, and Homer is at the nuclear plant not doing anything. And so the example was meant to sort of show this. Here's another kind of point, though, to keep in mind, that within HRS, you should always look at the variable that you're using If it's income, it's pretty obvious that a higher number means more income. If it's something like self-reported health, so that tends to get measured on a 5-point scale where 1 is excellent, 2 is very good, 3 is good, 4 is sort of what, mediocre, I can't remember, and 5 is poor, fair, right? So the higher your health is, the worse off you are. You're further toward poor than excellent. Very
Not more
counterintuitive.
health
It's
is
not more health,
better.
it's right, yeah. And so why in the world is that the case? Well, when you have a study of health, often what you have is something like that, self-reported health, and then you also have conditions like high blood pressure, hypertension. And do you have it? Well, how is that counted? Well, you have a 1 if you have that condition and a 0 if you don't. So the higher that index, the less well off you are. I think that's why it's measured that way. So the whole thing is backwards. The more of the X variable it's telling you, the less healthy that you are actually, the more unhealth. So that's one example of it. Here's another one in which the thing just got reversed, and I don't know why. 1 for exercise actually means you're the best. I guess, I don't know, it's like a inverse GPA. 5 is the worst. So that's another problem just to keep in mind. And so, the sign of the beta coefficient is going to change depending on how these things are measured. And it's a challenge. So it's important to look at the data, to look at the data codebook and try to remember how they actually code these things. So you might be interested in this kind of relationship, that weight is some kind of function of physical activity. And so what you could do right now is look at weight in wave 12 as a function of physical activity in wave 12. You could maybe look at it in wave 13 as a function of both of these if you thought that they sort of introduced, so maybe there's an exercise history that's important, and then trying to interpret it is kind of weird. But what you can't do in the current format here is do anything that keeps track of how you actually have measured this twice. You've got 2 different measures of weight. And so one of the things that's so useful about HRS is that you can reshape the data to take advantage of this and actually look at both of these measures simultaneously. So one pitch here is that, well, there's more measures, you're sort of better off, in a statistical sense, if you've got more measures of something that you care about. The other thing, of course, is that if you measure something over time, you're more likely to be able to pick up something that changes stuff and then gets a response. And that's, of course, the ideal in the study design world, right, is that you have people that are observed doing something, and then something happens, and then stuff emerges, and hopefully it's a good thing that happens. And of course, in the interests of many of the folks in the room, maybe it's employment turbulence or something like that could be very bad that happens, and then you get to see what emerges rather than kind of get just a snapshot of those who are well off and those who are not well off, and you might not really know exactly what's causing that, right? That there's a bunch of stuff all kind of happening at the same time in that picture. So how do you proceed? You stack or you reshape long. What this is showing is, here is our data set from the previous slide up at the top. And if we thought about a data set now that just measured respondents' weight at a particular wave, so now the wave is a new variable here. Here's our 250 from this wave 12, and our vigorous physical activity index was 3 for that person. It happens to be Homer. And so this becomes our new row, and here's our wave 12 measure for that. Here's Homer again in wave 13 at 255 and a 4 for the vigorous activity. And so this is the format of the data that you're going to want if you want to actually use all of these repeated observations. And it's also the format that you'd want if you'd want to run some sort of event study where you're looking at changes in these critical, here's our X variable, here it's the activity, vigorous activity, and here's our Y variable. So the RAND file it doesn't come out of the box looking like this, but there are quick ways of getting it set up to do that. And it's a very powerful thing to be doing if that's your cup of tea. You don't just have to look at a cross-section, you can also look at information in the panel. Okay. And let me just make a few more pitches here that looking for a panel fixed effect estimator is often a good thing to be doing. It's what Danny at the Brown Bag did on Wednesday. He was looking at a way in which you're kind of looking at things trending over time. Panel fixed effects is a lot like difference in differences. It means that you're looking at how things have been changing for different units based on some kind of a treatment. Now, there's no guarantee that there is sort of a unique treatment shared only by the treatment group here in HRS, because this is just observing stuff. If you can identify something that has changed, like for example, the literature on mass layoffs has often looked at sort of state-specific shocks. So what you might want to look at in HRS is these different trajectories of people's lives, and in some states are treated by the mass layoffs. You could think of it that way, and you might find some result that was, that in a seminar you could defend. The gold standard, of course, is that you actually have a treatment where you're signing people up to do this, and that's a gold standard. It's also rather rare. For folks who who come from other, for everybody, I guess, really in social science and statistical inference. I mean, random effects is another way of going with this, and it's another version of a model that you can estimate using data that are in this form. And I'm not as well versed in sort of describing that with a metaphor. It's not the same as difference and differences kinds of views of the world. Okay, why don't we maybe take a break? It's 2:20, and then when we come back, we could talk about a little bit of this. Like, how do you tell whether HRS has what you want in it? Does that sound good? So we'll take a break. We'll get back together around 2:30-ish. If you haven't signed the sign-in sheet, please do. I think it would be fantastic to set up an optimal out Google group that we can all stay in touch with.